This is a re-recording of an older video that I made on this channel, one of the first actually. In my opinion, it's the most important video I have made, and it deserves to have louder and better audio to back it up. Odds are, based on the view count of the old upload, you probably didn't watch this, so I do encourage you to stick around because you'll actually be able to hear me this time, and because this is a really important topic. A particular annoyance of mine and a pet peeve is when governments and people use historical nitpicking to form a lie and then they use the same lie over and over again until it is perceived to be the truth. It was once impossible though for historians to get the opportunity to point out historical lies in real time to an audience. But the internet and what Russia is doing in Ukraine right now, along with their justifications rooted in their version of history, provides us with the perfect opportunity to do this. With that long-winded explanation out of the way, and to the consternation of all the vatniks about to come screeching into the comments saying I'm lying even though I have sourced my arguments here, we're going to get to the meat and potatoes of this video. Quite simply, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are not the same country. They are not the same people, they are not the same culture. They are linked, yes, but they are different, inescapably so. Now, if you can hear me over the tankies and commie boos screeching in the corner, let's explain why I have to make this video. If one has picked up a history book that was not written by a Russian since Vladimir Putin became president, because you can only publish the truth in Russia, and who decides the truth? Well, that's the government, so take it all of it with a grain of salt with what they publish over the last 20 plus years, you'll quickly notice that the Slavic peoples have quite an interesting history, and that they do not come from Moscow, nor was Muscovy the first state of Rus, or even the home of it. That honour actually goes to Kiev, and the peoples who inhabited the Pripyat marshes. Now Russia admits this to an extent in their telling of history, but they would have you believe that after the Mongol invasion, when Kiev was destroyed in the 13th century by the Mongol horde, the Rus who survived migrated east into the horde for some reason, and eventually, after bravely fighting for independence, they received it. Quite the opposite occurred. Now, this is not to say it's impossible that people migrated east and fled east following the attack on Kiev. It's just that there's not exactly many sources to back it up, whereas what I'm about to tell you is very well documented. Incredibly so. Not every single region that was a part of the Rus was in fact conquered and assimilated into the Mongol Empire. In fact, what can be considered the first proto-Ukrainian Belarusian state formed in what is essentially now Western Ukraine, Moldova, and Eastern Poland, right on the edge of the Carpathian Basin. This was known as the Principality, and later Kingdom, of Galicia-Volhynia, nominally a vassal state to the Mongols. The Principality under a Kievan dynasty was ruling from Halych, was the last remnants of the once immense Rus, and they continued to develop their own culture and way of life. Meanwhile, in the northeast, in the previous states that dominated the Rus, such as Vladimir and Muscovy, they began to slowly grow in power and size as the Golden Horde buckled under the weight of successive succession crises. At this critical juncture in history, the once independent Galicia-Volhynia was absorbed into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and what is really crucial to note here, the northern lands of the Western Rus became part of Lithuania, and the southern lands became part of Poland. Ergo, the language difference of Polish and Lithuanian and the cultural difference began to affect the Old Slavic language of Rus very, very heavily. This absorption into the Commonwealth was a gradual process over quite some time, but was made easier by the fact that princes in the region had largely turned to Catholicism to curry favour with and receive military and financial assistance from their powerful Catholic neighbours against the non-Christian threat. Side note to this though, that throughout the existence of the Commonwealth, Poland would grow to dominate Lithuania, and slowly it would absorb lands under Lithuanian dominion into Polish dominion. Ergo, the Lithuanian influence did fall off, but it is still very inescapably there in Belarusian history. Muscovy, meanwhile, didn't convert and existed as a tributary state under the Golden Horde until the Golden Horde effectively began to break apart due to constant infighting. As such, the Orthodox Church, now schismed from the Roman Catholic Church, declared Muscovy as the correct successor state, and that the seat of the Rus Orthodoxy would be recognised as Moscow by Constantinople. This is partially why Putinism can be considered absolutism, as legitimacy claimed by Putin is derived in part from the Russian Orthodox Church. I made a video on absolutism and why I argue that Putinism is absolutism, earlier in the channel. I do apologise for the coffee can recording. Now, this brings us up to about 1648. With the establishment of what is widely considered as the beginnings of Ukrainian statehood, and to an extent the beginnings of a Belarusian statehood as well. And this is the Cossack hetmanate, or the Zaporizhian host. It is worth pointing out at this point that Crimea in itself is a remnant of the Mongol Empire known as the Crimean Khanate. The hetmanate itself is still considered a vassal state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Just a cursory look at this map here will show you that the rising state of Muscovy and the hetmanate are very different entities. However, what it does not show is the religious differences within the hetmanate, and to oversimplify about 100 years of back and forth arguing over leadership, the issue that would eventually split the hetmanate in two was that of religion. The eastern half of the hetmanate, that had been under Mongol rule, did not convert to Catholicism and instead remained Orthodox. The Polish-Lithuanian rulers, being Catholics, naturally sided more with the Western Cossacks, who were Catholic, and yada yada yada. Eventually the sides split on this issue and began to side against each other, with the Eastern Cossacks seeking support from Muscovy, who was only too happy to assist them against the Poles, because it would expand their territory. Now, I would like to point something out here. When the Eastern Cossacks met with the Muscovites to agree to a certain kind of vassalage under them, they needed translators. So different were the two cultures and languages at this point. The Eastern Cossacks would agree to vassalage under the notion that they would be nominally independent but would assist the Tsar if called upon in war. Now, this would hold true for a time. Very quickly, however, in the 1700s under Catherine the Great, the Cossacks were effectively told they are now Little Russia and Little Russians, and a Russian governor-general was appointed to rule over them, and the hetmanate was abolished. The Russian language was now forcefully pushed upon them, and following the partition of Poland and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 19th century, the Western Cossacks were also brought under Muscovite, now Russian, rule. The region we call Belarus, being closer to Moscow, was Russified much more intensely than the Southern Cossacks, and Eastern Belarus was heavily populated by Russian immigration, and the language was effectively stamped out, and the native Belarusian was banned multiple times throughout history. The same rings true in Ukraine with Ukrainian, and at this point I would like to say yes, the term Ukrainian is quite new. For a long time the people we would now call Ukrainian were referred to as Ruthenians. However, this is a moot point when discussing legitimacy, because the Byzantines, for example, were not called Byzantines, they were called Romans at the time. We simply use modern terminology to make history more understandable and easier to process, given the fact that it is an absolute mess at different points. Following a Polish rebellion in 1794, the Tsar began to become more and more distrustful of non-Russian speaking subjects in the West. To put it bluntly, the ideal subject was a Russian-speaking Russian. At this point onwards, the term Little Russia would begin to be weaponized to great effect in an attempt not only to make good Russians out of the Ukrainians and Belarusians, but also the Baltic states. The Polish-speaking University of Vilnius at this point was shut down, and at one point this university actually rivaled Oxford in terms of its research capabilities and its attendance. And a new Russian-speaking university was established to replace the University of Vilnius in Kyiv. The university would even be crowned with a statue of the Tsar. The weaponization of Little Russia relied heavily on the introduction and domination of the Russian language. The banning of the Polish language in the wake of the rebellion caused tremendous concern with the Tsar, and as such, the Ukrainian and Belarusian languages were limited greatly and further restricted and banned. Poets and writers kept the Ukrainian language alive, however, with people like Shevchenko buying into the idea of a greater Slavic union, with Ukraine as an independent part of a wider state. Think European Union style in a modern sense. He was arrested for this belief by Russian authorities upon returning to Kyiv and sentenced to 10 years service as a private in the Russian army and banned from the arts. In short, the idea of Little Russia was that the people who lived in Belarus and Ukraine could become good Russians and no longer harbour wishes for independence, fully assimilating into the motherland in air quotes, that is in big air quotes, under the Tsar. Conversely, the west of what is now Ukraine at this point was ruled from Vienna under the Habsburg monarchy. The Habsburgs took a different approach and fostered Ukrainian, again known as Ruthenian at the time, nationalism, and believed that having a strong nationalist Ukrainian movement would counterweigh any Polish nationalism, and would also assist in securing the Austrian Empire's eastern flank. Now this would come back to cause some pretty horrific consequences, playing the Ukrainian nationalists against the Polish nationalists, and this is something that Russian propagandists will constantly play up to try and divide Ukraine and Poland from each other. It is a very, very deep and dark topic, and not something that is in the scope of this video, but it is really worth researching. The situation continued and developed further right up until the end of the First World War in the East, where under the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and just before that, a short-lived pair of republics came into existence in both Belarus and Ukraine. These two states endured until the Russian-Soviet army invaded and subjugated the region. It is worth noting the Ukrainian People's Republic was not incredibly popular at the time. In saying that, the situation in what is now Ukraine and Belarus during the Soviet Revolution is an absolute mess, and I don't think any government could have honestly held it together without an incredibly large martial force, which the Soviets had. So, again, that is a massive oversimplification of something that we could be talking about for about 6 or 7 hours, whether or not the Rada could have held the place together during this period. And Brest-Litovsk in itself is an argument and a back and forth that could be going on for quite a while, particularly with the actions of Trotsky. The situation for Ukrainians and Belarusians, though, would worsen immensely under the Soviet Union following the death of Lenin. Lenin, it must be said, utilised national movements to further the spread of Marxist-Leninist doctrine. He is often referred to by propagandists in Russia as someone who was clearly a great example of the Ukrainians being treated fantastically under the Soviet Union. Lenin's ideal, above all, was pragmatism. Lenin was a very pragmatic man. He was willing to use things and make deals with what he would consider the devil to achieve his goal of revolution. This is why he makes a deal with the Germans to get through Germany to go back to Russia. This is why he's willing to negotiate with Brest-Litovsk. Lenin is a very pragmatic person, so to say that he is a defender of nationalist identity in places like Belarus and Ukraine, while factually true, it is very, very dishonest to make this claim. During the Stalinist era, things would be at their arguable worst, with the famine that we know today as the Holodomor, and this was a genocide. I will not have people turn around and deny that this was a genocide. It absolutely was, being weaponized to wipe out separatism and the people who were seen as traitors by an ever more paranoid Stalin. This was then followed by the invasion of Nazi Germany, which enacted a further genocide on the Ukrainian people. During the Khrushchev thaw, the situation for Ukraine in particular, but also to an extent Belarus, greatly improved, with the regime deridingly taking a backstep on cracking down on nationalism. It was still not legal to be a nationalist and to advocate for your independence, but at this point, the native dialects of Ukrainian and Belarus could be spoken freely in the streets. The Ukrainian and Belarusian SSRs as well would further to this point have their own anthems and their own capital cities, and largely their own apparatus of state would begin to grow. However, it must be said, and make no mistake, the current Ukrainian anthem, though, and anything that was, going for independence, was still incredibly banned. The restrictions were very, very tight, but that seed was planted. Now, it has been said by the Kremlin, and particularly the Vatniks and Tankies, that Ukraine is a Nazi state, and this is flat out not true. It is true that there were parts of the Ukrainian nationalist movement and Bandera and such during the occupation that committed horrific acts against innocent people. The Polish are often brought up, I brought them up before. However, history isn't as black and white as the Kremlin would have you believe. If it was true, then you could make the exact same reverse argument about Russians who joined the SS, and say that Russia is a Nazi state because XYZ. The simple fact is they did. There was a Soviet general himself who joined the German cause. Whilst there are parts of the nationalist movement that were bad, the absolute vilification of this movement, Ukrainian and Belarusian nationalism and national identity, is rooted in Tsarist and Soviet-era policies. Belarus in its current state has unfortunately fallen heavily into Russification under Lukashenko. But as we have seen over the last year and a bit, Ukraine has had one response to Russification in the modern context. They've just said fuck off. To sum this all up, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia are 3 different countries, 3 different cultures, 3 different people. Russia is not the sole true successor of the Kievan Rus. It is a successor state, yes, but it has no greater claim on the title of the mantle of the true Rus state than Ukraine or Belarus. But again, just one more time for people in the back. They are 3 different countries. And the fundamental point above all of this, if they're telling Russia to go away and stop bombing them, all of the history doesn't matter. They've made their choice. They don't want to be a part of Russia. Nothing Putin says and lies about will change this. Now, I'm aware as well, this is not exactly a funny video, but I consider this to be one of the most important videos I have made and will ever make, to be completely honest. So, if you did enjoy it, please do like, comment, subscribe, join the Discord. I recommend as a reading list to this as well, have a look at my reference list in the bio. I include my sources for this, and I really do recommend having a read of them. They are very, very good sources, and they will explain this very much more in depth than I have here. This is a 20-minute video covering something that could easily be a 20-hour lecture.